Mrs. Ellis was a quiet, elderly woman who lived a modest life in a small town. Every month, she walked to the local bank to deposit her pension check. Her simple attire and frugal habits often made her the subject of dismissive glances from the bank staff. One day, Mrs. Ellis approached a bank teller to inquire about a large withdrawal. The teller, a young man with little patience, sighed and said, "Ma'am, you need to maintain a certain balance for that kind of transaction. Are you sure you have enough funds?" The words were spoken with a hint of sarcasm, and the nearby staff chuckled quietly. Mrs. Ellis said nothing. She nodded politely, gathered her things, and left the bank. What the staff didn't know was that Mrs. Ellis wasn't just a retired schoolteacher. She was the widow of a successful entrepreneur who had left her a significant fortune. She had quietly lived below her means, preferring a simple life. But now, she decided it was time for a change. Not for herself, but for the community she loved. The next day, Mrs. Ellis returned to the bank, but not alone. This time, she was accompanied by 2 lawyers and a representative from a charitable foundation she had established in her late husband's name. As the staff watched in confusion, Mrs. Ellis walked into the manager's office and revealed her plans. She had purchased a controlling interest in the bank. The stunned manager could barely process her words as Mrs. Ellis explained, "For years, I've watched this bank serve the wealthiest while neglecting the everyday people who need it most. That ends today." After completing the acquisition, Mrs. Ellis addressed the entire staff. "Yesterday, I was a customer," she began, her voice steady and calm. "I came here looking for respect and understanding, but I was met with judgment. Today, I stand before you as the bank's new owner. Let me remind you, every person who walks through these doors has a story you cannot see. Treat them with the dignity they deserve." Under Mrs. Ellis's leadership, the bank underwent a remarkable transformation. She introduced programs to help small business owners, offered financial literacy workshops, and created a low-interest loan fund for struggling families. The bank became a pillar of the community, known not for its wealth, but for its compassion. Months later, the same young teller who had dismissed her approached Mrs. Ellis with tears in his eyes. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "Working here has taught me so much about kindness and humility. Thank you for giving me a second chance." Mrs. Ellis smiled gently. "We all deserve second chances," she replied. "What matters is what we do with them." Years later, the bank became a national model for ethical banking practices. And Mrs. Ellis? She continued to live in her modest home, content in knowing she had turned a place of exclusion into one of opportunity and hope.